Thank you.
I call Chris Whaafoe.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. It's my pleasure to speak to the second reading of the Harmful Digital Communications Bill. And it's also a pleasure to speak when the National Party claims a virtue on the monopoly of the virtues of right and wrong. Because if you look at their recent history, what they do have a monopoly on is the virtues of wrong. Because if you look at what they've done with the GCSB and the way that they use that, and the evidence that has come out and that they use that for the wrong purposes to try and further the career of Tim Grocer. If you look at the virtues of them with being wrong with the pork barrelling that's going on in Northland, you'd think that they have the monopoly on what is virtuous and right. But Mr Speaker, after that contribution from Jackie Dean, Mr Speaker, I think you will see from the evidence that has been presented from this side of the House and through the media that they don't have a monopoly on the virtues of what is right and what is wrong, but they simply have a monopoly on what is wrong at the moment. It's a disappointing contribution from Jackie Dean, because I think we deserve better from the government, because this is an issue that is important, as she did make mention of youth, but it's absolutely paramount that we get this issue right for our youth. It's been a short time since I left high school, Mr Speaker, but technology has advanced so that these things here and the internet is ubiquitous. We're growing up in much different times. My teenage niece has much higher pressures around social media than I would have ever had to. I got bullied. Everyone in the house probably got bullied when they were at school, but we dealt with it face to face. But these days, Mr Speaker, these things and the internet take bullying to another level, and teenagers these days we have to protect them in an effective way to make sure that the ubiquitous nature of the internet and online and text and email, that their lives are as good as they possibly can be. And Mr Speaker, we on this side of the House don't believe that the bill as it stands right now is an effective measure to make this country and their lives as safe as possible when they interact online, whether that be via email, whether that be via text, whether that be via Snapchat, Facebook or Twitter. We want to make sure there are effective measures, Mr Speaker, to make sure that especially our young ones are safe. Mr Speaker, this bill comes about from a Law Commission report, and they commissioned some of their own research, which I believe found that around about 10% of young people have been prone to some kind of online bullying. When they narrowed the numbers down between, I think it was around 14 to 29, that number went up to about 22%. So it is an absolutely real issue that online bullying or cyberbullying is a real issue for our young ones. So I am a bit disappointed, Mr Speaker, and the government for making this a political issue, because I think there's an onus on us to make sure we get this right. And there was an attempt to preempt what was going to come from this side of the House about we're disappointed that the Labour Party doesn't want to support this measure for our young people. Well, if this government, Mr Speaker, was serious about these measures, this bill was introduced in late December 2013. The Select Committee submissions were closed in February 2014. That process was rushed, and this bill, Mr Speaker, has been sitting on the order paper for months and months and months. So if this government over there is serious about protecting our youngsters from harm from cyberbullying, we would have seen this much earlier. But you've got to look at the DNA of this bill, Mr Speaker. And it was introduced by Judith Collins, who in her tenure as Justice Minister and Police Minister and Corrections Minister was all about introducing bills of the justice nature that looked tough but actually didn't do a lot. And Mr Speaker, we've got another version of that here. There were, and I didn't sit on the Select Committee, but I read a number of the submissions and the papers that the Ministry of Justice put forward to the Select Committee. There were a number of details in the bill that would have made it effective that were completely absent from the bill. And that can be seen, Mr Speaker, with the nature of the penalties that were placed in the bill. There was some debate as to whether or not they were appropriate. given the nature of some of the crimes that are being prescribed in the bill. And some debate was had about whether or not they marry up with other pieces of legislation. Mr Speaker, I will put to this House that that is one example of where they were making up the legislation as they went. Because if they were doing this properly, everything would have lined up. But the Select Committee had to go backwards and forwards with officials to make sure that those things married up. Mr Speaker, if the government was serious about getting the details right on this, that process would not have happened in the Select Committee process. Another example of that, Mr Speaker, is whether the approved agency, what powers the approved agency has, what it can do. Mr Speaker, the Select Committee sorted out what the approved agency will do and can do. Not the government in putting forward this bill, it was the Select Committee that filled in the detail of what an approved agency can do, and they still don't know what it's going to do. And they still don't know where that approved agency will sit, who it will be. There's some talk of, well, one year this agency might be the approved agency, and then next year this agency will be the approved agency. Mr Speaker, that is another example of this piece of legislation just being put out there to try and be popular at a time when the government was on the ropes with Roastbusters. And this, I go back to my earlier submission, Mr Speaker, this is a piece of legislation that we need to get right for our young people. And for the government to say that this side of the House doesn't care about preventing harm for youngsters in terms of cyberbullying is just nonsense. We want to sit here and get it right so we don't have to come back and make the changes that really need to be made in this bill. And there may be a glimmer of hope that the government might see that in the committee stage and actually make the amendments that are necessary, Mr Speaker, to make this piece of legislation effective. Because the way that it stands now, it isn't. Because I won't bore the people at home who are watching this instead of the cricket tonight about the process. But if it gets serious, if a complaint gets serious, Mr Speaker, the complaint will end up in the district court. That is our district courts, which are already inundated, Mr Speaker, with a whole lot of other work that they are struggling to do. So what we're asking our district court, which is under a lot of pressure and has had budget cuts over time, is to take on more responsibility on complex cases and to make rulings on that. So how effective in reality, Mr Speaker, is this piece of legislation when it's asked the district court to do much more to take on new responsibility, but we're not funding them for that, Mr Speaker. Oh no, heaven forbid, they'll do it for free. And they already, Mr Speaker, have a huge workload which they say they cannot handle. Mr Speaker, this piece of legislation has been rushed and still has plenty of holes in it. And Mr Speaker, we would hope, and I think Claire Curran has already suggested this, that the government might reach out and try and make the amendments necessary that are in this bill. Because as it stands right now, it is just punitive, and there is no resource in terms of education and preventative measures to make sure these kinds of things don't happen in the first place. And the Minister is wrong. In the overseas jurisdictions, there is resource put into prevention and education to try and make these things, to try and reduce the harm. But nowhere in this piece of legislation as it stands right now, Mr Speaker, do we see any commitment from the government to serious and effective education and prevention around cyberbullying. This is a government that sings to the top of the hills in terms of its police portfolio, that it's prevention first. But Mr Speaker, in this growing area of cyberbullying, we're not seeing any resource or any effective measures being taken when it comes to looking after our youngsters. There is some work to go to make this piece of legislation effective. We would hope, Mr Speaker, that the government recognises that and in a mature way that we will engage, will take up the offer to make the piece of legislation effective, because as it stands now, Mr Speaker, it does not.
I call